in 8 minutes. This is my disclosure. So I get the pleasure of working with Paul. Paul's our charismatic, talented Captain Kirk, and sometimes I end up being Bones, but...
You got a new nickname.
So it's always best if you can anticipate that the imaging is going to be tough during a procedure rather than discovering that on the table. So obviously pay attention to the screening images. If there's notations of difficult intubation of the probe or a pediatric probe was used, look for those type of warning signs. I would also encourage you to always obtain supine imaging during screening because sometimes during these procedures when you get the patient flat, the image deteriorates, and it's nice to know that ahead of time. And I always like to go into the procedure room a little bit early to do a complete study, just make sure there's no surprises. There are just a couple things you can do during the procedure to prevent further deterioration of the imaging. Sometimes you're doing long procedures, you're getting a lot of 3D images, a lot of color 3D, and that really heats up the tip of the probe. And if you keep it hot too long, you can cause some esophageal edema, and your images will get worse, and there's nothing you can do about it at that point. Also, kind of minimizing going in and out of the stomach too often, you can get some air in the esophagus that can make your images worse. Beyond that, it's really just experimenting, adjusting settings, incident angle adjustments, and sometimes changing to 3D, you can see it better, or even using transthoracic imaging. So just the basics with settings, optimizing your focus, frequency, and gains, optimizing your crop box for 3D, your stitch adjustments, those are the basics. So the main thing is incident angle adjustments, and by what I mean by that is changing your perspective. So that could be a slightly different probe tip position, or it can be a different angle. So you can try to advance or withdraw a little bit, flex, extend, left, right. Other than that, you can try looking at it from a different angle. X-plane can be helpful, especially with multiple mitral clips. When you have a 3D image, tilting it on its side or around can give you some additional information. If your supine images got a lot worse on the table, sometimes putting a towel or a pillow underneath the right shoulder can tilt the torso just enough that your images improve. So with that said, let's just go through some examples here. So often during mitral clip, it's hard to get your transeptal needle indentation in the mitral annulus in the same picture from the traditional four-chamber view. So I think many people have found out now that this reverse four-chamber view can be very helpful, somewhere between 135 and 180, and you can often get both the indentation and the mitral annulus in the same view. X-plane imaging, especially when you have multiple clip situation, can help you identify which clip you're looking at in the long axis and also help give you a grasping view for the second clip. Sometimes, despite your best efforts, you don't know really where you cross the atrial septum with your transeptal puncture. So I like to get this view of the atrial septum from the left atrial side with the mitral valve below. There's a ring there, and the aorta is on the left. And you can see here that our wires cross at the very top of the fossa, and it's not too anterior. So this gives you a quick additional information of where you actually crossed. Similarly, 3D can help you. Here you can see, obviously, we're very anterior, and you're going to end up inevitably with an aorta hugger, which can be a little bit difficult. When you're obtaining 3D images of the mitral valve, if your mitral annular plane is tilted upwards, like on the left in the 2D setup, you're not going to get ideal 3D images. Sometimes that's the best you can do, and you have to live with it. But oftentimes if you spend a little more time, this is that same patient, get the mitral annular plane flat, you can get much better 3D imaging. When all else fails, you can always go back to the transgastric view, which we used back in the Everest days. Sometimes you don't know whether the clip rotated when you advance into the left ventricle due to some stored torque. And a quick way of assessing this is just getting your 3D on phos view, turning the gain down, and then you can see the clip arms in the left ventricle and it'll give you an idea of location and orientation. It's a quick thing you can do. Often there's a question of whether you got enough leaflet on the clip arm. And Paul calls this the gripper lifting sign with the new NT device. If you see that once you drop the grippers, you can see on the lower right, the grippers are lifting. and the leaflets inside the grippers are generating enough force to actually move those grippers, you know that you have a decent amount of leaflet tissue underneath the gripper. So in TMVR, from transapical access, you really want to get a view of the true apex as well as having the mitral valve annulus opened up. So here you can see this patient, the initial images, they're overgained and they're foreshortened. You don't really see the true apex. So you need to spend a little time, optimize the gains here, advance the probe a little bit, extend a little bit, and then you can open up and see down to the true apex. And this is critical for transapical TMVR. This is an example of the tendine. It's an asymmetrical valve, and with the higher part of the valve being meant to be anteriorly directed, and you can get a quick look at this during the procedure just by tilting the 3D image up on its side. This is a characteristic appearance during a tendine procedure if the valve is being opened a little too atrial, and you'll get a valve that looks like this, and if you bring back the valve down a little bit closer to the annulus, it'll improve your picture quite substantially. There's a lot of talk about the LVOT. You can get a view of this with 3D also just by flipping the image upside down, tilting it up towards the aortic valve. And you can get a rough estimate of the area. Some things you can't see with 2D that you can see with 3D. This is just, we were fooling around. Paul was snaring a wire in the left atrium. You would never be able to watch this under 2D imaging, but sometimes 3D just gives you a better open field of view. There was a live case of a paravalvular leak closure just before this. Sometimes when you're imaging this, this defect looks quite large, and you can't tell how much of it is actual defect or is there just dropout with the 3D imaging. So in these instances, if you just use 3D color, flip the image upside down, you can see the regurgitant orifice better and get a better idea of the true size of the defect. Similarly, sometimes the defect is hidden a little bit underneath the ring, and if you just have the standard view, it's hard to see. So just tilt up the image up on its side, and you get a much better idea of the defect, and you can see the wire going in. Here, Paul's placed 3 plugs. Sometimes the TE imaging is just not going to help you, and you have to revert to transthoracic imaging. And sometimes the transthoracic imaging is actually much better for certain things than your TE images. This is an example of a patient who had a previous transapical TAVR who developed a pseudoaneurysm. And you can see by TE imaging, it's in the far field, not optimally visualized. But with the 3D, with the transthoracic probe, I'm able to see the pseudoaneurysm in the neck and see the flow in and out of that. Paul's able to access the pseudoaneurysm from the chest wall with a wire, get it out into the aorta, and retrograde advance catheter in, confirm the position with some contrast, and then deploy a plug. And you can see that you can see this much better by transthoracic imaging than you can by TE imaging. At some point, you got to know when to close the door and keep it closed. The imaging just will not allow you to safely do the procedure, and despite the arms grabbing you, you got to, for everyone's safety, just keep the door closed. Because if you don't know where you're going, you might wind up someplace else where you don't want to be. So in summary, it just happened that a little acronym, just remember APESIT with a H in there somewhere, depending on whether you want an R-rated acronym or not. That's all thanks.
Richard makes me look really good.
Well, I was just going to say, Paul, all this time we thought you were good. You know, now,
it's all Richard.
Now, you know, it turns out, okay, we know why you look good now. Okay, so Richard, thank you. And you know, saying that, I would be remiss if I didn't add this piece I meant to say a minute ago as well. Both, I mean, Align MHI. Manny, the Piedmont picture, the pictures, the images that you all show, and all the pictures everybody showed today, they're stunning resolution pictures and things that, certainly if we look back 10 years ago and 20 years ago, we didn't know. Look at the anatomy, especially as cardiologists, we didn't know. Look what TAVR taught us. Look what we've learned. And if you look at what even over that span of a couple decades, transcatheter from the neophyte days in the mitral space to today, producing these images. But more importantly, as Ted Feldman said this morning, producing an entire array of imagers that really led to this discussion. And we know who they are, not only across the country, but across the world. And the little vignette that I was thinking of as we started this talk, and I made the comment about Manny, was when Mac and I first tried to get a sort of place saver for our kids, starting mitral clip, and we heard about all these 6-hour cases from Europe and early U.S., he and I both realized we don't have the patience to do that. There was just no way we were going to be able to do that. And so we simply took Paul Graber and said, okay, let's go do this. So we won from the beginning for exactly what this talk was about. So I think it is, kudos to the chefs, kudos to all the great imagers and everything that we've learned and developed over time.